Nestled smack dab in the middle of an industrial park in Lafayette, Louisiana, is one of Louisiana's most unique treasures. There's a lot of neat things to see in Louisiana, and there's a lot of neat nature that's really here as well. Among those things, there's quite a few cool stories that are tied in with trees. Down by Mandeville, Louisiana, there's the Seven Sisters, a collection of trees that we're told by scientists, are about 1,500 years old. And then there's the Evangeline Oak, made famous by the poet Longfellow. But this tree is, well, famous or interesting for a different reason. From a ways off, it looks just like any other live oak in South Louisiana, but as you grow closer, you recognize that this tree, in fact, is 3/4 of the way uprooted and lying on its side. And it's been like that for almost 100 years. Somewhere in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a powerful hurricane swept in from the Gulf and uprooted this tree when it was maybe only 50 years old. And for the last 100 years or so, it's grown on its side. Its roots mostly uprooted in the air. It had just enough of a root system to survive. Certainly a lot of trees that went through a traumatic experience like this one did would have in a few days begun to lose its leaves. The tree would have died. It would have been cut up and used for timber or maybe just rotted where it lay. But the neat part about this tree and this story is that it continued to grow. Year after year, pushing out new leaves, new branches, new foliage. And in time, the trunk actually began to turn up to once again face the sun. It's a reminder to all of us that survival isn't always ideal. It's not always a perfect situation. But when we survive, it's inspiring. The Bible stories often captivate our attention. We read through the text of Scripture and we see Moses and the children of Israel passing through a wild and rugged landscape. We see Abraham leaving the Ur of the Chaldees and going to the land of Canaan, a land that God would show him. We hear of Jesus walking through the streets of Jerusalem. Remarkably, there are survivors in that story as well. Survivors like, well, part of the Antonian fortress, a military complex that was built inside the city walls of Jerusalem. If you were to get off the main street in Jerusalem and actually go down several sets of stairs below years and years of rubble and debris and rebuilding in the city of Jerusalem, you finally arrive at the paving stones of the original Antonian fortress from the 1st century A.D. Part of it is the smooth stones that were inside of the courtyard and the complex there. And then part of the stones that you see are the rough stones with grooves cut for the hoofs of the horses and the animals that were a part of the street. Streets that no doubt Jesus and his disciples walked upon. Over in the corner of the fortress in the middle of the courtyard, there's an inscription, a bunch of lines that are drawn into a stone. It's actually a game of chance. Possibly the same game of chance that was played for Jesus' garments. Or if you were to go to the southern steps of the temple, in the 1970s, a big excavation project began to move a lot of the debris that had been shoved off by the Romans when they destroyed the temple. What they found were the original stones of the street that Herod had built leading up to the temple. The shops that were on either side of that street. And most importantly, they found the steps that led into the arched tunnelways that were to go up onto Temple Mount. Neil Armstrong, the first man to ever set foot on a celestial body outside of our own earth, had an opportunity to go to the Holy Land and to visit there. And his one request, he said, I would like to see something that was here when Jesus was. At that time, a lot of the archaeology that's been done today had not yet been done, but some of it had. And the archaeologist that was showing him around took him to this very place, to the southern steps of the temple. On the exit side of that, where there's some original paving stones, original steps that led from the temple. He said, without a shadow of a doubt, Jesus would have walked on these stones leaving. Neil Armstrong's response is priceless. He said, "This is the most awesome thing I have ever experienced." The man who were to take the first step on the moon considered the opportunity to walk in a place where Jesus walked to be even more exciting. And then there's, in the northern part of the land of Israel, in the Tel Dan area today, an interesting set of city gates. For years, classical archaeologists believed that it was the Romans who had invented the arched openings. As they began to do an excavation on the gate of a city there, they realized that human beings had been building arches a lot longer than the Romans. Because here was a city gate made out of mud bricks with a perfect archway. The neat thing about that arched gate is that archaeologists were able to really pinpoint its date, and they realized that it was built and up during the time of Abraham. You might remember in Genesis, the 14th chapter or so, when Lot was captured and taken from his home there in Sodom and Gomorrah area. And he was taken off with a lot of other people by a raiding party. And Abraham and his soldiers, or his servants, followed. And they followed him, and there was quite a battle that ensued. They eventually recovered Lot and the other kings and their possessions. And it mentions that they followed them to the gates of this particular city. Today they're nicknamed the Gates of Abraham. All those things are, well, they're survivors. Paving stones that were surviving from an era a long, long time ago. Rounded and worn by the hooves of animals and the shoes of people who had walked upon them. Steps leading up into the temple, trod by the faithful who came to worship God and to bring their sacrifices. City gates that no doubt Abraham passed eyes on as he pursued his nephew and the others who had been taken from them. There's one other survivor, though, that I find to be remarkable. It's across the Kidron Valley from those southern steps of the temple, in a small, quiet garden, the Garden of Olives. As you go there, you find a whole collection of gnarled and almost gruesome-looking trees. And in the midst of those trees, there's one particular old tree, a tree that scientists have determined is well over 2,000 years old. A silent witness to Jesus' suffering and prayer that night in that very garden. You know, there's a difference to me between that old olive tree and those stones, or those steps, or those city gates. The difference to me is that in the 2,000 or so years since Jesus walked and they witnessed Jesus being in the city of Jerusalem, or a much greater distance of time when Abraham stood outside of those city gates, that tree has continued to grow. It's continued to bear fruit. It's continued to accomplish its purpose. They're all survivors, but one of those survivors accomplished something. The others are reminders of an era that's bygone. But one of those is still a part of the current era, still doing the job for which God created it. I guess there's a question we have to ask ourselves. Do I want to be old and broken and unmovable? Or do I want to be broken and yet still growing, still accomplishing something? This old tree has been around for a long time, broken from its, former glory. No longer are its roots buried into the ground completely. No longer does it have that beautiful live oak shape. And yet, this tree has continued to grow season after season. It reminds me of something that Paul said in 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, picking up in verse 16. He said, "So we don't lose heart." Sometimes when things happen in life, when we get uprooted, when we get destroyed, it's easy for us to lose heart. Paul said we don't lose heart, though our outward nature is wasting away. Outwardly, we're wasting away. Inwardly, we are being renewed day by day. Even though outside we're broken, even though outside we're uprooted, even though maybe on the outside we're gnarled and scarred and age has certainly taken its effect on our lives, inwardly, we are being renewed every day. Inwardly, we're becoming better and better. And then Paul finishes, he says, "For this slight and momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison." As we look at the things that are seen, but as we look at the things that are seen and not as the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen, well, those are eternal. Paul reminded us that it's important for us to put our life into perspective. To recognize that sometimes it's the things that we don't see in life that really define us more than the things that people do see. It's easy for somebody to look at somebody who's gone through a hard time in life or has been uprooted or has been scarred and to look and to see that damage, to see those scars, to see those wounds. Well, what Paul is reminding the church of is the fact that although outwardly the signs of the struggles that we've gone through in life might be very evident, inwardly, we can become stronger and stronger. A survivor isn't necessarily somebody who's had it easier, but a survivor is somebody who's determined that as long as they have breath in their lungs, they are going to accomplish the purpose that God has put them on this world for. As long as there's still some root in the ground, as long as there's still an opportunity for them to do good, even if it's not in the form or the capacity or with the ability that they once had, they're still going to pursue that. They're still going to strive to finish their race. I think there's a few things that we can do to help us become people who are survivors. A few things that we can do to sharpen our survival skills. And so, as we close out our lesson this afternoon, I want to share a few of those things with you. How do we become a survivor? I think the first thing on that list is that we set small goals. Sometimes we run into a difficult situation and we try to figure out the entire course of the rest of our life in that very moment. Sometimes when we're uprooted, sometimes when we're scarred and broken. Sometimes there's so many questions and so few answers. And sometimes the appropriate response for us is simply set small goals. In this moment, in this day. Jesus asks a question. He says, which of you can add to your life but one moment by being worried? Then he says, consider the grass of the field, the lilies. Even Solomon in all of his splendor was not nearly as well dressed as one of these. Or consider the birds of the air. They flutter and they fly and we lose track of them. But Jesus said not one of those falls without the Father recognizing that. How much more do you think that your Father cares for you? Then Jesus gives us some of the best advice that we can find anywhere in life. He simply just tells us, live one day at a time. Because tomorrow will have plenty of enough trouble all of its own. It's okay, guys, to not have the entire course of life figured out. Because the truth is, we never know when those storms of life are going to move in. We never know when those challenges are going to hit us. We never know when we might be uprooted or we might be scarred. And the story and the plan that we have will be forever changed. Jesus said, just do right now what is right in front of you. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong in maybe having some plans or some dreams. There's nothing wrong in looking towards the future and making preparations for that. The Bible talks about that and says that a wise man does that. But let's not put so much weight on those things in the future that we miss the opportunities that are right in front of us right now. The second thing that I think is important for us to do if we want to be, well, a survivor, is to develop a team. You know, we need other people. For a lot of us right now, this whole quarantine thing is, well, it's really difficult because we're used to having that friendship and the camaraderie. We're used to gathering with family or with coworkers or with our church family and sharing the meal together on a Wednesday night or hanging out at one another's house and drinking some coffee. Because of the current situation, a lot of those things are just not possible. And it's difficult for us because we're people that need a team. You might remember a few years ago, there were 12 boys and their coach that went on a hiking trip in Thailand. They went down inside of a cave, and then because of some heavy rain, the water rose and it sealed off their escape. And for the next 10 days, they remained trapped in the darkness of that cave. 10 days later, when they were rescued, you might remember that they came out of that cave, and by and large, they were in fairly good spirits. And experts looked at that and they said, now, what allowed those young boys to be able to deal with something that would have broken a lot of people? And they realized that a lot of it was just the fact that they had one another. They had a team. They weren't alone. And because they had that team, it helped them to have the courage and the strength to carry through. The third thing on my list of things that we need to be a survivor is simply this: know when it's time to reach out for help. Peter was given an opportunity of a lifetime. His first step was not to step on the moon or to step on a place where no one had walked for a very long time. No, Jesus was given an opportunity to step out of a boat into a storm-tossed sea and walk on the water. And it tells us that when Peter saw the wind, he began to lose faith and began to sink. It's a windy day today. You can probably hear that in my recording. And the wind is not something that we can actually see, but we can feel the effects of that wind. Peter gets out there and a ways away from the security of the boat and a ways away from the security of his friend Jesus. He's caught in that place in between. And in that moment, well, he sees the effect of what nature is doing around him. And he begins to fear. And that fear causes him to begin to lose his focus, and he begins to sink. But what does Peter do? Peter cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus stretches out his hand and pulls Peter back to safety. If we're going to be a survivor, we've got to recognize that there are times when we need a helping hand. We need somebody to step into our life and to pull us up. And let me tell you that the best person to do that is Jesus Christ. Jesus knows the struggles that we're going through. Paul reminds us that we don't have a high priest that's not able to sympathize with us in our weaknesses, but he was tempted. He struggled in every way that we do, and yet he never sinned. Number 4 on my list of things that I think are so important for us to be survivors is simply this: we have to learn to be flexible. So often after we're uprooted or we're scarred or we're hurt in life, we tend to try to take things back to the place where they once were. We try to undo what's happened. We try to change the story. And sometimes that's just not possible. Whenever that big wind blew through and blew this tree over, There was no one here to prop this tree back up or put its roots back down again. No, it was left with a couple options. It was either going to be flexible and grow in the place where it had been uprooted, or it was going to die. And the same thing is often true for us. A lot of times we can spend a lot of energy and time trying to undo what's happened, or we can simply learn to accept it and figure out how to move on. And I think one of the keys to being flexible is simply acknowledging and recognizing that we are not in control, that we're not always able to undo what's been done, that we're not always able to make right things that are wrong. Sometimes we have to learn to live with the brokenness, and it's okay. Our Heavenly Father knows exactly what it is that we need. And I'm reminded of the time that the Apostle Paul went to God and he prayed on 3 separate occasions. He said, Father, remove from me this thorn in the flesh. And we don't know what it was. It's obviously not important. Paul didn't tell us. But God's response back to Paul is that part that Paul wanted us to get. Because God said to Paul, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, because my power is made perfect in weakness. You know what? Truth is, if this tree had just been any other regular live oak, it probably would have been uprooted long ago. There probably would be a building like so many other buildings that are around this place planted on this spot. But because this tree is a survivor, because this tree went through a traumatic event 100 years ago or so, it remains growing and strong and green today because it inspires and motivates and challenges people. Its flexibility allowed it to have a purpose far bigger than just being a tree. And the fifth and final thing on my list of 5 things that I think are important to be survivors is simply this: that we focus on opportunity and not on loss. If you've lived any amount of time, if you've gone through any amount of challenges in life, you know that we lose maybe more than we win. As you grow older, you begin to lose that energy and that rebound ability that you had when you were young. Your mind begins to slip a little in places. Sometimes we lose finances due to a job layoff or a financial catastrophe. Sometimes we lose relationships. And it's important for us to stop and recognize that we have a choice as to what we want to focus on. Do we want to focus on the opportunities that are there in front of us? Or do we want to focus on those things that we've lost? The Bible tells us that Jesus, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. He was focused on the opportunity that we would have to have oneness and completeness with God, that we might be clothed in his righteousness, that we might be able to join in at his Father's table and to celebrate and to commune with them forever in eternity when this life is over. For that opportunity, for us, Jesus endured a terrible season of life. We have an opportunity to do the same thing. You know, a lot of times in life we get to a place where we're like, you know, I just want to quit. I just want to give up. I don't know if it's worth it anymore. I don't know if it's really worth hanging in on this marriage or trying to keep this relationship going. I'm tired of my job. I'm tired of school. I'm tired of my kids. I'm tired of the struggle. I'm tired of this pain. The list could go on and on. And in that moment, we have a decision that we have to make. Do I want to be a survivor? Or do I want to be a statistic? There's a lot of us or a lot of trees that probably could have found it real easy to give up. There's a lot of times in life where quitting is a lot easier than carrying on. But when we carry on, it's then that we become, a legacy. And we have an opportunity to inspire other people. to themselves carry on in the difficult situations that they've been given. We're surrounded by survivors. You can find them in the stones and in the rocks and in city gates and steps in the land of Israel. You can find them growing as gnarled and old and torn and twisted olive trees in the Garden of Olives. And sometimes you can find survivors, well, right in your own backyard. People who have gone through difficult times and yet have remained faithful. And their example to all of us is an inspiration. If you're one of those survivors, I want to thank you for the example that you have given to all of us. And if maybe today you're struggling and you're going through a period in life where you say, you know what, I just want to quit. Maybe for you, this old tree will be an inspiration. It'll remind you that, you know what, I may be 3/4 uprooted, but there's a little bit still hanging on. And I'm going to make the best use of that to accomplish the purpose that God has put me here for. We can be a survivor. We can leave a legacy. And I pray that we all do that.